ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Reena Agarwal, Vice Provost for Faculty at Georgetown University and Director of the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy. Again, welcome to our weekly global virtual FinTech seminar series. Today, our speaker is Professor Adair Morse. Adair is on the faculty of the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. And she's doing some fascinating work in a number of different areas. We were just talking about the work that Adair is doing in the area of sustainability and impact investing. So in addition to FinTech, she's looking at a whole lot of other issues. I also want to mention Adair's work as an executive board member of AFFECT. Many of you might know, AFFECT is the committee of the American Finance Association, designed to promote the advancement of women academics in the field of finance. I know at Georgetown, especially during this COVID-19 crisis, we in the Provost's office are really trying to figure out how can we help women faculty who have additional responsibilities. And it's not just what happened in the spring semester, but the fall semester is coming up. And women who have kids at home, the schools are out, and they've got to take their classes and move them into a hybrid kind of a format. It's very challenging, and we are definitely working on different ways to help our faculty, and especially our women faculty, in as many different ways as we possibly can. I do invite you to learn more about the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy by visiting our website. In addition to our weekly FinTech seminar series, we're doing a number of other events that are open to the broader public and are somewhat non-academic. So please visit our website and follow our Twitter handle at GUFinPolicy. We at the center are most grateful to our sponsors and our partners for making these events possible. I want to thank all of you, and Professor Alberto Rossi will moderate the Q&A, but Adair would be very pleased if you ask questions as she goes along. So use the chat feature or raise your hand, and please ask questions anytime during the seminar. And Adair, with that, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me to this virtual seminar. It's a delight, and I really appreciate the leadership Georgetown has shown on these issues for many years, but particularly now. So please interrupt, as Reena said. It's much more interesting to have a discussion, and partially I say that reinforcing because I'm going to present sort of two papers. Really what I want to present is this law paper, which is joint with Bobby Bartlett at the law school here, as well as Richard Stanton and Nancy Wallace, my colleagues here at Haas in Finance. And that is a law review paper, so you can find it on my webpage, but you'll find the 191 footnotes a little bit daunting. Bobby and I are writing kind of an implementation of that, so that's more for the finance audience. But the law part, I think, is really important to think about accountability of algorithms and credit scoring in particular, but Alberto and I were talking before, wealth management, other issues. There's a lot of topics where we're using algorithms in finance that these laws apply. So with that, I'll dig in. So how economists think about discrimination. So economists like to think about taste-based discrimination and statistical discrimination, where taste-based, the traditional Becker discrimination, where an individual dislikes a particular group and then wants to discriminate from them participating. In the original theories, the taste-based discrimination should not persist because in the long run, competition should erode it away. De facto, discrimination persists, as we know, and so we're not quite in that long run scenario. But as we move into the algorithmic world, we lose that face-to-face opportunity for discrimination. And so then we're on the other side of this slide, the statistical discrimination. And here, the original theories, going back to Arrow and so forth, the R and Phelps, the idea is that you're using a protected category, like a race, to proxy for something that's unobservable from a group. De facto, you know, that form of direct statistical discrimination is illegal and not the biggest concern, at least in our context in the US, but rather, although frankly I've seen the word black in some algorithms that are using to sort people. However, the main issue that we have is the indirect statistical discrimination and how you think about that. So that is the issue. You know, the mapping of the law to the economist thinking is clear on the below. Make taste-based discrimination illegal. In any case, it's not profit maximizing, so that's, you know, everyone's okay with that. And make sure the technology doesn't implement the direct form of the Arrow-Phelps discrimination. But the problem there is, what about this indirect statistical discrimination? And how does the law inform what we can and can't do in algorithms when we know in finance we're using you know, hundreds of thousands of variables to credit score? And so that's where we're going. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the law, and then I'm going to suggest, coming out of the law, this input accountability test, which could be implemented for testing for variables, whether they're consistent with being consistent with discrimination law. In other words, let me say that differently. If I were a lender, how can I say a particular variable is non-discriminatory? And this is a test that we hope would be empowering for lenders to be able to know that they're implementing these thousands of variables without being discriminatory, right? So we're not trying to go after the lenders per se, but rather to give them some way to feel like that they are complying with the law. If you talk to the big lenders, they're petrified of showing up in the New York Times for having discriminated when what they're doing is implementing these big algorithms. And so they want to be empowered to be able to show that they're not discriminating. And then I'm going to show you an application in credit data. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm not going to read all this, right? That Civil Act rights says, you know, basically, and it's written for employment, basically, you cannot discriminate based on protected categories. Okay, that's fine. And not only can you discriminate, but you can't have processes that discriminate. That's what the basic realm there. But that doesn't help us with understanding how do you implement this. So what has happened is a series of Supreme Court cases, and then some of which has been codified in Congress. Okay, so the framework that has come out of the Supreme Court cases is referred to as the burden shifting framework, and I'll explain what that means in a second. And this case law originally came out of this Griggs versus Duke Power case, and then it was codified in the Civil Rights Act in 1991, and then there's some other case laws that we'll mention going forward. Before I get into that, all of this stuff is written in terms of employment, not in terms of credit. However, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act have adopted this framework for credit. So everything that was written in terms of employment also applies to credit. Okay, so here is the most important thing I'm going to say, and it's just a simple slide. So the burden shifting framework goes like this. Let's say a plaintiff wants to bring a case of discrimination to the court. The burden is on the plaintiff to first identify a practice where there's statistical disparities between members of a protected group and an unprotected group. So somehow there has to be that, one group is treated differently than another. There's evidence of that. Okay, once you find evidence, the plaintiff convinces the court of that, then the burden shifts to the defendant, the lender. Okay, and so you see here, the original burden shifter was written in jobs related for the position. So I'm gonna go to the next slide where the language changes to creditworthiness. So the defendant must demonstrate that the practice is, the practice, the objective of the practice was, in terms of credit, to understand creditworthiness for the loan in question and consistent with business necessity. So that business necessity thing is the key phrase that is used over and over and over again, that the practice is, there's two parts here that's really important. One is about creditworthiness. Notice I didn't say profits, right? There's no profit line in this. In fact, the court's been very explicit that in loans it's creditworthiness, and that this is the business necessity need. So understand what we're saying now. Let's say a lender is using a variable. In a paper that Nancy, Richard, Bobby, and I wrote it, we talk about the name of your high school. The name of your high school is a variable that may pick up hidden wealth, for example. And so, the idea of using a variable is that it is a business necessity to get a creditworthiness. Okay, so then if the lender is convinced, it convinces the court of that, then the burden shifts back to the plaintiff, to say, well, okay, maybe that was the case, but there's another method you could have used that was less discriminatory. All right, now I'm going to contrast what I just said, and I hope I was reasonably clear on that. Do I have any questions? No? Okay. So I'm going to contrast that with what lenders say they do. Okay, so lenders, let's say you have a platform lender that has thousands of variables, and that could be a big bank. It doesn't have to be a standalone platform, because the banks are doing the same thing as the platforms themselves. And they're going to use machine learning to do credit scoring, and they don't want to discriminate. So they ask their lawyers, how can we avoid discrimination? And what the lawyers are telling them is, to avoid discrimination, what you need to do is implement the least discriminatory approach. Okay, so I'm going to define what that is. So let's say they define the target. The target, the target is a machine learning term. And for lending, the courts have been very explicit, the target is creditworthiness. Okay, so we have some sort of measure of default, and they want to do a predictive model of default, right? That's the standard thing. And they're going to throw these thousands of variables in. Okay, so what do? They get data scientists, they run all these machine learning ROC curve type analyses with the thousands of proxies for missing fundamentals. They interact them all, they do all these things that we've seen, which are fascinating to do. If you haven't tried it, it's super interesting to see what plays out. And they generate, these ROC curves, the idea, if you haven't seen them, that you want to move this direction toward the top left yellow area, where you're getting more true positives and less false positives here. So your predictive accuracy is a measure of predictive accuracy. It's not a perfect map to a logit pseudo R squared, but it's kind of, it's sort of monotonic in that way. So, imagine that this data scientist has these thousands of variables and interactions and all kinds of things, and they get a predictive model of ROC of 0.78. And what the lenders have been told to do is to say, okay, the best model is 0.78, and I've used thousands of variables. Well, let me run a bunch of other models that get 0.78 or close to 0.78 and choose the one that's least discriminatory. So for a statistician, that's really an easy thing. right? Because if I have thousands of variables, there's all different kind of interactions I can do that get close to the same predictive power, right? And so I can do 500 of these and choose the one that's least discriminatory and say, oh, look, I've done the one that's least discriminatory, right? And the problem with that is, let's just, here I've written at the bottom, let's just say that there's a pure model of just the cash flow variables that we as economists would put in, and it has a predictive accuracy of 0.68. Then adding the 1,000 variables has increased from 0.68 to 0.78. And the question is, is that moving from 0.68 to 0.78 discriminatory or not? Because that's not what the lenders are doing. They're just taking all the 0.78s and seeing which one's least discriminatory. Was that clear? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So the problem with this is, it's illegal under the burden shifting framework, right? Let's go back to the second burden here. The defendant must demonstrate that the challenge practice is job related for the position in question, or is creditworthiness, right? And consistent with business necessity. Nowhere in what the lenders have done in my stereotyping in the last slide was there any check whether the variables are picking up creditworthiness. So in the first paper where with Nancy and Richard Seton and Bobby and I, we talk about how, well, if you're using this high school variable, and you're trying to proxy for wealth, which you can't see, maybe maybe it is picking up wealth, but maybe it's also correlated with race beyond wealth, right? And so how do we think about that in the law? What does the law say? Is that consistent with business necessity? Okay, so that's where I'm going to then go to the second Adair Morse case, right? Are there any, let me pause for a second. Are there any questions? No? Okay.
Oh, yeah, I think we're pretty, yeah.
All right. All right, so Adair versus Rawlinson. This is another Supreme Court case. So here, a California prison wanted to hire prison guards. And the prison determined that the job required necessity is strength, which is a legitimate business necessity using the terminology of the court. But they couldn't measure strength of applicants, right? They have all these applicants. So they use proxy of height. They actually use height and weight, but I'm simplifying this example. So a group of female applicants sued, and they won this case. And what the court said is that indeed strength is legitimate as a target, that is a job required necessity for being a prison guard. And indeed, height predicts strength. Height predicts performance, right, in the job. So it is legitimate variable. If you think about this in terms of lending, indeed, the name of your high school predicts default, right? So that's normally the criteria that we're interested in. But the court said, but the strength needed is a specific strength, and height is the height measurement penalizes females beyond the business necessity. That's the key thing. So whether the idea that the high school is penalizing a particular race beyond the role of picking up hidden wealth. Okay, so what we've done is we've translated that into econometrics, or a simple statistical relationship. So we call this the input accountability test. So the idea here is we take height and we decompose it into two pieces: the part related to strength and a residual. And then we test whether this residual is further correlated with the protected category. And it's very simple, right? It's the idea here is just having these variables. You have to have strength, right? And one can come back and say we don't see strength for these applicants, but this is where the role of the training comes into play.
So sorry, Adair,
so once you do this decomposition.
So yeah, sorry, Adair, just a question. But so is this something? So because one thing that I'm thinking about this test is that in a univariate sense, obviously makes sense. But suppose that I think that I want to have strength and another covariate. So like, do you do in a univariate sense this kind of test, or do you also have additional controls or something? Because then that opens kind of a problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. So let me phrase it in terms of the creditworthiness context that we're perhaps more used to. So let's take my high school variable, right? The name of my high school, and you know that is a dummy variable, but it could be something else, right? And then what I would put on this side was not. I would put all of the fundamental variables of creditworthiness. So if we think about what is creditworthiness, you know, the fundamentals that we're trying to get at is your ability to pay back a loan. So you can think of life cycle or permanent income type variables. Your income, your expected income growth, your cost of capital, which is your credit score, generally taken. Your endowment, you know, your different pieces of what we would put the variables in there that are cash flow. Now, interesting, like education. Education, you would think predicts income growth, but education itself is not a cash flow variable, and so that is also a proxy for something else. So it's just the variables that are the fundamentals that we think the court would say are these targets that are the business necessities are ones that are fundamental cash flow variables. So you can load them all in there. You can do interactions and you know, different ways to implement them structurally. You can get more complicated. We're sticking here, you know, with very simple, trying to get the conversation going in a simple linear setup. But likewise, you can do interactions on this side by just looking at the bases of interactions and testing different ways.
Okay, great.
Okay, so this is the input accountability test that we are positing that's consistent with the case law coming out of the Supreme Court from the laws on discrimination. And this is not at all what the people issuing credit are doing, right? It's not even close to what people are doing. So you know, there's some challenges, you know, with what I just said. There's a nice. This is also a legal paper, Kleinberg, Ludwig, Monathan, and Sunstein paper about talking about the importance of training data sets to be able to understand discrimination and to be able to understand the use of variables. So that is also a discrimination paper that's very important in this realm. There's also that I should have said that falling under the IAT that how this could be a problem. Sometimes you don't see default, right? If you're looking at applications, you don't have default. So the training data sets being ones that you can look back on the historical data to estimate, right? That's what we do. There's also a harder problem in our context is maybe measurement error. Default is not just an artifact of creditworthiness because it does have behavioral context in it, right? For example, I'm going to give another example in the next slide on how measurement error in the target can be a problem, and then standard errors as long as your data sets go large. Let me go back a slide. When you regress the second thing, the residual on gender, you know, as you get into the millions of observations, this beta 1 is always significant, right? Even if right, the p-value problem. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But let me just give you an example.
Sorry,
yeah.
Adair, just one question. If you go back one slide. So, but from an implementation perspective, suppose that I wanted to have strength, and then someone else comes in and say, oh, I want to have strength and the strength squared, for example. And in one case, I get one answer, in the other ones, I don't. So what would be the way to split how would you go ahead and decide?
Yeah, so let's say that, let me just rephrase. So let's say that one lender or employer says, no, strength is not actually our variable that we want to use for the sorting, it's strength squared. And so I'm interpreting this directly, strength squared is an entirely different thing. It's about having, you know, extreme power. right?
Mhm.
Rather than, you know, or you can think of it, actually in this context, it's probably more like ln strength, right? The log of strength.
Mhm.
You don't need extreme power, but you need consistent power to be a prison guard, right? And it may be that strength itself fails this test, but log of strength is okay because women may have consistent power but not have extreme power
Mhm.
relative to men on average, right? And so interpreting literally, that would be fine in the IAT, right? As
Mhm.
long as the scoring mechanism for hiring this prison guard was using that implementation. So we're not trying to make it impossible for people to use scoring. You know, we're big on scoring is powerful, but to do scoring in a responsible way, so we know we're not statistically discriminating against groups, right? Okay, so let me tell you this example because it's really kind of interesting in a
Sorry
way.
to interrupt you,
So this is,
there.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. So I have a question from Brian Wolf. He's saying, if I understand correctly, to test the AIT, the econometrician needs information on the protected group, gender, race, etc. Do lenders, employers, underwriters usually have access to all this information?
So that's correct. That's a great question. So the answer to that is no, right? Unless you're applying for a mortgage, you don't see race. But you still need to be able to say the variables you're using for your car loan lending algorithm is uncorrelated, you know, it passes this test. So that in the car loan context, actually, I was just looking at a nice paper by Alex Butler and some co-authors on how they've matched the car loans through credit histories to HMDA to get to the race, right?
Mhm.
So does that solve the problem that because I've come up with this paper? No. The lenders would need to be able to get a sample, this training data set, then show that their variables are okay in the training data set that pass the IAT in the training data set, and then they can use the variables in the applications going forward without ever seeing race. So that would be the idea. It's the importance of this training data set, which is why this is key on this slide by this Sindel et al. It's quite of a powerful group of co-authors here. Paper about really, you know, the importance of finding training data sets to test these things. That was very important.
Adair, just another question along the same lines. So a lot of times this data is self-reported and it's optional. So how do employers deal with that? I mean, think about higher ed, right? A lot of this data is self-reported and it's very incomplete.
So that is going to be some error in the target variable as I've got here on the slide. There's going to be errors in it, and that is surely a problem. Which my next slide is going to give one example of that problem. But I don't have great solution for that, right? I know there's problems in being able to do it perfectly. I know there's problems in biases, and there's problems in only seeing for default for existing loans, and the fact that the rejected loans are not in the data set, right? There's lots of levels of problems. What our objective here in coming up with the simple IAT is to start the conversation away from the last step once you've already used these 1,000 variables, and to focus on the inputs themselves. Right?
Yeah.
That's the main objective, and it's a great question, and I sadly I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it's fairly easy now to get training data sets, right? I mean, one can buy social security numbers on the web, sadly. And so, you know, it's much easier now to be able to isolate these things, even on protected categories. That's
Can
kind
you
of a sad
elaborate a little more on United Health?
Yeah, yes. Let me go through. Let me do this slide because it's super interesting example. So this is a science article, and what happened is that United Health is an insurer, and the insurer works closely with the hospitals. And so United constructed an algorithm to inform hospitals about the patient's sickness level so as to allocate resources to the sickest patients, how many times the nurses had to come by, which tests they should be doing, this sort of thing, to make it easier for the hospital logistics. The problem is, what United Health used for their training data set, for their, to gauge the sickness, was historical expense data rather than the actual level of sickness of a particular patient, right? So they used expenses that they've spent on past patients as a measure of how sick that patient was. The sad reality is, though, is that African American patients historically spend less for the same illness and the same level of illness. So the result was that the algorithm caused African Americans to receive substandard care in the hospitals as compared to the white patients because of this algorithm. And so here's a case going back to the prior slide. One of these problems, the measurement error here, they didn't see strength, which is the level of sickness. What they saw was the proxy for that, which is the expenses on sickness. And so there was a mismeasurement here.
Adair, are you there? I think we may have lost you.
I guess a little internet problem here.
Yeah, exactly. She may have.
Yeah, we'll give it a minute, a few seconds.
Yeah, it's just gonna probably pop back. Yeah, because she got disconnected. She's gonna be reconnecting soon.
Oh, here she is. Adair, you're muted.
Oh, let me
No,
unmute you.
non-Wi-Fi good zones.
Oh yeah, perfect. I think now you're back, but I think you need to reshare your screen.
Reshare my screen. Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. Did I don't know when I
think you
did I finish?
you cut off when you basically were saying that the measurement here was the crucial thing, in the sense that they were kind of measuring in expense instead of how much the disease was expensive to treat, but not like the degree of sickness of the person.
Okay. So just then that ends the talking about this. I'll talk about the standard errors and when I show you the finance implementation. One last thought before I do that. Let me go to so the economists have chimed in on fixes to algorithms causing bias, and there's more papers than this. But the idea here is, why can't we just use statistics to fix the scoring problem causing any biases? So why can't we debias using statistics? Well, there's two answers to that. Why it's not that method, which sounds fine statistically, doesn't work here. The first is, that's a average concept, right? Statistics are an average, right? And the law is about individuals. So the law is not okay with you fixing on average, but you're imposing that on, if someone becomes discriminated against because of an algorithm, the fact that you fixed it on average is still not okay, right? You're still liable in the court for that person having been discriminated against. So that's the first. The second is, there's case law on this. So the Ricci versus De Stefano, there was a New Haven firefighters that wanted to, they did this test, and it was a similar thing as the prison, where they're doing a wanting to figure out who's qualified to be a firefighter, and it turns out the test that they implemented was biased against a racial group, and so then they decided to toss that test because the results caused disparate impact, and a group of white and Hispanic firefighters sued, alleging that the city's discarding of the result constituted race-based disparate treatment. And the court ruled that in favor of the suit that indeed you cannot discard based on using a variable. So that it was not okay for New Haven to exclude something because it caused that disparate impact. So this, reminds us of all that's gone on with the Harvard case in terms of the Asian and white students that are applying to Harvard have sued because of feeling disparately impacted against. So you cannot fix these things using a race variable, right? That's the key thing here. And so any fixes as statisticians that we might want to do, we'd have to use a race variable to figure out what we need to fix. And the court said you can't use a race variable to do any fixes. So, all right, let me do some finance. Okay, so now I'm going to show you implementation, and we're going to do some credit scoring using a large data set. All right, so U.S. household debt is on the order of 14 trillion. And, I did some back of the envelope things that if annual debt turnover is 15%, suggests that the new float is about 2.2 trillion per year, really back of the envelope. Of this, how much is algorithmically decided? Again, back of the envelope using some data I've done through the prior paper, saying 45% of lenders and mortgages have fully automated lending. Being a little bit conservative, I came up with about 800 billion, roughly, really roughly, is algorithmically decided. Okay, I can be off by a lot on those back of the envelopes, and still it's a large number. And so here we have a quote here by Zest Finance. Zest does a lot of the credit scoring for smaller lenders that don't do it in-house. We put in hundreds or thousands of variables in them and blah, blah, blah. Okay, all right, just motivating. It matters if these algorithms are discriminating. There's a lot of money at play. Okay, so this question, how can the use of machine learning, credit profiling avoid being inadvertently discriminatory? Fuster et al. Have asked this question in our paper as well. Others are asking this question, So what I want to do is chime in on this by running an ROC analysis on this lending, and then implement those tests and just see how hard it is for a lender to comply with the implementation of the law we're suggesting in the IAT test. Okay, so that's my agenda. So I have data from a commercial lender in Eastern Europe that's unnamed. I have about 300,000 consumer loans. The loans are made in stores, they're point of sale loans, but they're not collateralized by a good. And the data set contains default. I have 124 variables I'm going to use today. I have more than that. Many of them are categorical and can be made long and can be made interactive. I can make as many variables as you want with that, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for footprints of credit score first. So I'm not new in this footprints literature. Even these papers are not new. There's a lot of new papers on this. The Berg et al. Paper with Manju is just a wonderful paper if you haven't seen it. On the I just remember that picture they have where they have Manhattan and who's got an iPhone versus an Android versus another, and how you can predict default out of that simple picture, which is super interesting. There's work in context of mobile phone usage data elsewhere, and then Annette had a paper early on about consumer good products they buy and how that you can profile people out of that. But there's more here. So I'm not inventing this. What we're doing though is we have a bunch of different variables, different categories, and I'm going to look for which categories have the most footprints of credit score over and above the fundamental variables like credit bureau and application variables, right? I'm going to look for this other stuff, which is extra variables. And then I'm going to test each variable to see if it passes the IAT test. Then I am going to come back and say how much have I cost myself in predictive power if I exclude the variables. Okay, and let me just tell you at the beginning, it's not going to cost you very much, right? In a way, this is a pro lender kind of paper. Not by design, but just that's the reality here. So the fundamentals. So I'm going to use that word fundamental to mean things that would be in a like this life cycle permanent income thing. So income, credit score, debt, credit, other indicators of your cost of capital, assets, things that, credit bureau stuff, standard credit bureau plus application stuff. Okay, I'm going to call those fundamental variables, which the court are going to be happy with these being business necessity by definition. Okay, all right, so these are, yes.
Data, do you have specific data under goods besides car? What other kinds of goods?
Yeah, so I have in the goods variable, what I haven't done yet, I actually have more on the goods. I haven't broken it down into just, this is early, I don't have this paper written up yet, but I have not broken it down into what the goods categories they are, but I do have that, I just haven't used it yet. But I will implement that before in the next, in the next iteration. But that's what Annette did. Annette's paper is not published, but for no particular reason, it's a good paper. But she takes the goods of people that were buying in a store in Mexico and sees whether you can profile the behavior. Is it a good, or does a good indicate a fixed effect that speaks to your credit risk? And that's what she finds, that you can tell what type of person the buyer of these goods are in terms of credit risk by what the good is, which is interesting. Okay, so note that my income here is a nonsensical amount. If you're thinking through your European currencies, you're not coming up with anything. These are monthly incomes. It's been disguised. So I'm not disclosing this under, I'm going through the IRB and I'm trying to figure out what I can and cannot say. So I'm sorry, I'm being, I didn't disguise this income, but the lender has. So I'm unable to say that today, and hopefully by the time I get this paper fully written up, I can be more revealing. Yes, so these are the fundamental variables. I'm not going to go through them deeply. I'm mainly interested in just showing you how predictive the models are. Then I have living and family variables. So in the data set there's a difference in marriage and civil marriage. So at first I was putting down here religious marriage because it's, I think, but I don't know that these are ones that registered in a religious institution of some sort. This, by the way, this data set is across countries, not just in one country, but in Eastern Europe. But in any case, but there's a big distinction in these two in terms of credit score, credit profile, children and so forth. Then I have the goods that we've already looked at. Then I have the occupation variable that you can define into these different categories. Then I have, I'm sorry, I'm flipping, just I'm not focusing so much on each variable, but on these big categories in general. And
do you have like small business owners in here?
These are all consumer loans. But would some of these be small business lenders, small business owners?
Okay.
My occupation categories are not that defined. They may be in the other. That's an interesting question though, given where we are in the world. I'm writing that down. Then shelter variables. The data set has a lot of information on asking each individual, what kind of housing situation they are, and then they do some relative score on, this is not how many elevators you have, but what is your elevator, the number of elevators relative to everyone else in the sample, which is interesting, and entrances and other profiles about your shelter. Then Then I have some soft application variables. So the number of documents you submitted, the number of contacts you have, your social network, how many defaulters there are in your social network. There's some other paper about Facebook friends defaulting and how that predicts your default. Whether your spouse is present. And actually one that I later recategorized as, I think is soft, is this, whether you give your office phone number is an interesting variable, which I'll come back to in a minute. I'm going the wrong way. Then finally, the prior credit proprietary variable is the previous good LTVs and previous applications, and these sort of variables are more proprietary to the lender. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this simple ROC stuff, which is just running a logit on fundamentals plus all these variables. I should say I implemented these, you know, I was debating whether to do a full machine learning and let it just do all the interactions, and I ended up not doing that, but doing sort of a quasi in between a guided machine learning where I let the data speak some, but guided it with some economics. Just I probably should let it fully go, but I'm trying to, you know, the name of the game usually what the lender does is they take all those variables I just said and they just let the machine interact and do anything they want with them, right? I couldn't quite stomach doing that. Just I wanted some economics to be able to present when I'm doing the test. And so I did sort of a quasi thing of doing some lassos and trying to optimize the number of variables and so forth. Okay, so how did I do? This is just the default is a function of the fundamental variables. I haven't put them all here, but you know, income, credit, you know, the ratios that we normally see, the credit score. There's a series more than one credit score, so I took the max and the min, your assets, this sort of stuff. There's prior balances in this estimation too. I just didn't show it here on this slide. So my pseudo R squared is 0.087. You can just say whether that's good or bad. You know, in logits, it's hard to get much R squared. It's not great though. My area is 0.72. Okay, so that is my baseline. Now what I've done here, I'm not showing you any variables, but I add, that's this regression. I add in all these sets of variables that I just showed you with the fundamentals, and then I put them all in together. I'm seeing where I can get more, this is that footprints thing. I'm seeing where I can get more footprints of credit score, where I can increase my pseudo R squared or area under the ROC curve. And so you can see in pseudo R squared language, I go from 0.08 to 0.108. Is it improvement? Yeah. Is it a great improvement? You know, it's some improvement that the lenders would put some value on. I need to have another line down here. I haven't done it in terms of what's how many, how increase, you know, the predictive accuracy, what the percentage of correctly predicting default and what that means for dollars, right? Or some money in it, right? So I need to do that, and that's in the to-do list to see whether this is meaningful. And I probably need to do a better job of letting not just do a guided machine learning, but letting the machine learning be a fully machine learning and do all the interactions and such. But as a first pass, I did it this way so that I can do the IAT test. Okay, so then I want to just run the input accountability test and show you those results. I know I've been probably talking for a while, but these are pretty straightforward. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, let's say I'm going to test the variable elevator. Okay, so first I decompose elevator equals the loading on fundamentals. Here it is, elevator equals the loading on the fundamentals. Yeah, plus a residual. Then I get this residual and I regress that on female. So I have also age in this, but when age in some jurisdictions is a protected category, so I'm not. I'm just going to run the female test, right? And so as I mentioned before, there's a problem that in big data sets, this beta 1 is always significant, right? And that makes it hard for a lender to want to do this. They would want to just cut their, keep making it smaller and smaller samples, right? It would be biased against the large lenders. So what after spending a lot of time thinking about this and figuring out what is legal, we can't go down the economic significance argument because this is law. There's no sense that 5 out of 10,000 do not matter, right? There's no sense that something that is small in economic significance is it's okay to allow a little bit of discrimination, right? That you can't specify that and be consistent with the law. So we found this D value approach to the P value problem, and that's the next slide. Okay, so the paper here, which has been talked about quite a bit, is called the P-value you can't buy, and the idea is to keep buying bigger and bigger data sets, and then you can get the P-value you want sometimes, right? That's the idea here. And the basic idea is that rather than doing a comparison of group means, the idea is to compare a randomly chose single female to a randomly chose single male. And so where P-value, you take a coefficient and you divide it by, under normality, you're putting in the PDF here, divided by the standard error, right?
Standard error,
That's
yeah.
the standard thing we do, right? We take the coefficient divided by the standard error. The D value takes the coefficient and divides it by the standard deviation. So you take out that, right? Square root of n from the denominator, and that becomes as if you're just comparing one female and one male. So is this something entirely new? Not really. It's the foundation from the Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test that we've used for medians test. When you pull one from each, when you're comparing two groups, and what's if you're just doing medians comparison tests that we sometimes do in our summer stats. And actually the D actually stands for discrimination because it's the same as the area under the ROC curve used as early as 1975 by Bamber. So it's not something we're familiar with in finance, but maybe we should be. In any case, it's an appealing way to deal with the fact that it's a lot more stringent. Let me be honest, it's a lot more stringent, but without doing some of these other corrections, the Bonferroni or the economic magnitude ones, to deal with this p-value problem that, of course, we're all very familiar with. Okay, so let me just show you the results, and then that's pretty much where I am. So here I'm implementing the IAT test. So what I've done is I've got this residual. So let me go back 2 slides real quick. So I run elevators on all this stuff, and I got residual. Then I'm running residual on female. Okay, so here. Down here is my regression where female is here, and these are the B1s. Now, what is this up here? I'm interested in whether you're discriminating against women in this setup. Does that mean that you can discriminate against men? Yes. So the law doesn't specify men versus women, or doesn't specify whites versus Latinx or blacks or anyone else. The implementation has mainly been on the minority, right, or on women, right? And so my test is set up as a one-sided test, which is what all this top is showing which I'm worried about a negative in this, and I'll explain that in a second. So I'm going to interpret this as one-sided, but one need not, and that is the Harvard case that we're all familiar with the affirmative action kind of movements. And so, but I'm gonna focus only on discrimination against women. Okay, I've got this non-civil marriage, right, which I think of as like a church or mosque marriage or something like that, right? And why I've got it yellowed. So let me show you these boxes so that we can interpret here. So what the first line is the coefficient from the logit. So what this negative sign means is that having a non-civil marriage lowers the default risk. Okay. So if you're married and you were married in a church or mosque or another religious institution, then your default risk is lower, which means the scoring of this variable are going to reward those, right? If I'm doing credit scoring model, it's going to reward those. All right. So, but the residual here means that women are less likely to be in this category after orthogonalizing to all those fundamentals. That means that the use of this variable penalizes against women. Is it significant in the D value? The D value is you're looking for a deviation of 1% around 50%. So it's an awkward thing. They should scale it differently. But so this 47 and being of the right sign means that this is different. This fails the IAT test. Okay? Right, but the other variables, note the other variables in this particular one, all of them pass.
Yeah.
So widow, even the value is different. Women benefit, but
sorry there, I think we're missing you. Your internet connection may be a little slow. Yeah, I think we're going to reconnect probably in 30 seconds.
While Adair...
I think Adair is back.
Okay.
I think Adair is back. Oh, sorry, Adair, we lost you. I think.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. It's a bit embarrassing.
Oh,
no. But there's not much I can do about it.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, so we lost you when you were talking about in the previous slide, I think.
So the occupation, all biased against men. Yeah.
Okay.
You were talking about widows, Adair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So being a widow means you default less in this data set, which means my credit algorithm is going to score
again.
Yeah. So, I was wondering, is there an intersection of these variables? So, for example, widow and age.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's I mean, in principle, you have that. You have to think about a lot of them, right? I mean, depends on what you are kind of really interested in.
Yeah.
I think let's see if Adair comes back. I think, yeah, she is back.
And muted.
Yeah, exactly. Let me unmute her.
My office to shut down, so I apologize.
Perfect. I think that, yeah, if you can share the screen just once more. Perfect. Yeah.
Adair, I was just asking, what about the intersection of these variables? So, non-civil marriage and children, widow,
Yes.
something else.
So you could run that category, and maybe I should run that category, right? You just run the interaction, right? And so I should, in fact, I should, I'm writing that down. Because that is, this is the whole thing, that these things are probably predictive. Having,
yeah, exactly.
you know, the living in rural, right? Over here we have rural, being rural with a number of children, right? The different pieces will matter in a interactive form, and so I should run that and then do the different tests. I was just trying to keep it simple for conveying. Yeah. Okay, let me just go through quickly. I don't want to belabor. So the occupation variables are also very predictive at default, but at least some of these, the low skilled workers, but they're biased against men, not against women. And so in my being only looking at the one-sided test against women, they do not fail, right? This gives phone. If you give your office phone, it indicates something about your being comfortable with your job or whatever it might be. So it predicts lower default. You get a good scoring on gives phone. Women are less likely to want to give their phone number, perhaps some social norm around that. And so this does not pass the IAT, right? Notice that I've only had two. This one building one is not really significant, but I it's close, and so I just highlighted it. But the shelter variables are not discriminatory, really. The elevators, despite my using that, is not discriminatory. And I'm just kind of zooming through these just because it's, I think you have the idea here. The previous good LTV does discriminate against women. If you had a previous good that you got a loan for and had a high LTV, which women are more likely to do, then you have a higher default risk. Okay, so social network defaulters, of course, matters a lot in terms of credit scoring, and only marginally women are there, but this is an interesting variable in general. Okay, so there were only 3 out of the 37 that I ran in the simple first pass, and when I took those 3, how much ROC or how much pseudo R squared sacrifice, I should really do this in dollars, and so I have more work to do. So, I implemented here's my ROC curve, and my ROC curve went down trivially from 0.7434 to 0.7409. My pseudo R squared, these are small differences. I should put that in dollars, but you can see it's small. So the point here being, it wasn't really very costly for this particular lender to comply with the IAT, and now they've been able to assert that they are, that they have done these discrimination tests that are consistent with the law, at least in the U.S. Here's that regression. So I'm coming to the end, which is probably good since I keep flipping off here.
Sorry, there. I just have a question. But do you think that this kind of argument can be used by lenders by saying that, well, I was not making that much money out of discrimination, so I should not be penalized, or I should not be fined that much?
No, I mean, if someone gets hurt, they should be penalized.
No, exactly. I totally agree.
Right, but it's the other way around. What I'm arguing is it's not that hard for someone to run these tests, and I wasn't sure what I would find. If I use p-values, I know what I would find, because the bigger the data set, the more variables you're going to reject. But once I figured out that this d-value is more appropriate for the setting, I wasn't sure, and frankly, I think it's a very lender-friendly, like, here's something to do. I see a hand raised.
Sorry. Yeah, we have a question from Francesco da Junto. Let me unmute him. Go ahead, Francesco. What's a second? Ask to unmute. Oh, I don't think I can unmute him. You may speak, Francesco. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Adair. I mean, that's super interesting. And just wanted to ask you one kind of big picture question going back to the law side. So it seems like normally we think about how to use these instruments to then get into some kind of decision by court that would create some precedent in common law, like in the US. Now, in this case, it seems like the nature of the test per se is actually very, very kind of case specific, because we could have that some of these variables do predict defaults, or some of these variables could be based on the IAT test indicating discrimination in one setting for one lender, but not probably for the other. So it's really very kind of data specific. So how should we think about that? Because I mean, normally, at least, I mean, as a person who's not clearly doing law, I would think about the decision of the court on one case, often sort of creating a precedent in the sense of saying, well, from now onwards, probably nobody else wants to use that specific variable anymore, because otherwise the court will say you are discriminating, even if maybe given their pool of creditors or their specific setting, that very variable would not be discriminating in their case.
That's an interesting. My first reaction is our initial design was to empower lenders in their dealing with regulators rather than the courts. Although I think the test is totally valid for court as well. But lenders are looking, and the regulators, we've talked to all the regulators after the first paper in DC and elsewhere, are looking for a way to implement ways that self-reporting like banks do for their value at risk kind of models, how banks could come forward with information to say our algorithms are consistent with discrimination law. Now, what you said though is totally valid. One lender tests this variable and it's okay in their data, and one test is not okay in their data. And how do we deal with that, and how do we go forward? I had never thought about it, to be honest. I think that, as you said, that would have to play out in precedent of where the court views the weight of evidence in the different tests. But at least, at a minimum, giving a way for lenders to start thinking about their inputs rather than just doing these output corrections, which are illegal de facto. That's kind of what our hope was. And as I keep saying, it's an oversimplified way we set this up as a linear simple test. And you've already brought up a number of points here. But that was the agenda. And I don't have a great answer other than that, though. It's a good question.
Very interesting stuff. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm pretty much winding down. There's so many things I haven't done here in terms of the actual implementation. I know that. So let me just go to where I was going. My agenda, hopefully today, has been really to pass along the law in a way that makes it useful for finance people to think about research in this area. That's really why I put that, and that's why I did this implementation, is so I could have a chance to talk about it in forums like this. Otherwise, I'm really interested in what it means for lenders. As we know, the lenders are using so many more variables, and where we're going with consumption credit payments all collapsing to one. Who's the most natural lender in the world is the bank called Google or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And that doesn't exist at the moment, but it does in China. Alibaba is that, right? And so how do we think about data, and how do we think about the policy debate, and how not just against lenders, right, but empowering them, the ones that want to be doing the right thing on this front, how can they feel like they can invest in the hardware that they're actually investing in to do this, and the human capital. So that's my first thing is the finance research and understanding the law. And I wanted to debunk the literature about that, AI poses no danger because it removes discretion. Anyway, you could correct it ex post. That's just not consistent with the law. And so hopefully I've accomplished a little bit of that and provided this test, and I showed you some initial application things that I need to work on some more. And I'm sorry about my internet, but I really appreciate it. And if there are any more questions, I'm sure I'm a little bit early.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me take a moment to thank Adair for the awesome and super interesting presentation. And yeah, I think we are out of time. Thank you again, and make sure to check us on Twitter at GU FinPolicy. And next week we're going to have Uday Rajan, who's going to be talking about the paper When Fintech Competes for Payment Flows with Christine and Haoshan Zhu. So make sure to connect again, and thank you so much for logging in.